Hi, well, this is a short screencast for CIMA E2 covering BPP practice and exam kit questions. And this first screencast is on mixed bank 6. Okay, so we have here question 16.1 concerns a company HJJ, and they're looking to either outsource or perform in-house their payroll function. So essentially it's the classic sort of make or buy decision, but you will be familiar from your studies that transaction cost theory sort of takes things a little bit further than this make or buy decision and talks about some sort of new words, new phrases that we need to be familiar with. So the way that this question pans out is that we're given a series of possible words, and we've got to simply fill in the blanks. So if we look at this first sentence here, they're saying that if the company decides to do it in-house, obviously management will focus on monitoring and controlling the function, its cost, use, and performance. This is known as, well, obviously it's the hierarchy solution. So that's the first solution. That's in effect the make solution under TCT theory. Okay. And if the company conversely enters into the contract to outsource it from an external supplier, it asks what the cost would be called, and in essence they are transaction costs. And what sort of costs would be included on that banner? Well, a variety of different costs that you should be familiar with, not least the sort of initial contract costs, legal costs and monitoring and controlling costs, obviously, and indeed possible penalty costs if there's anything that goes wrong with the arrangement, okay, or if it's not performed to the specified standard. So that second one there is transaction, and what they ask for is just the missing blank here is that second option under TCT is clearly the market solution. Okay, so we have hierarchy versus market, and certainly the transaction costs are the ones that are relevant if we're going out into the market. One other thing I'll draw your attention to here is something that we've seen in another MCQ question, is where they refer to transaction costs, i.e. the monitoring, controlling costs, legal, etc., as indirect costs, as opposed to a direct cost of going out into the market, which is essentially the cost of the outsourcer themselves. So just be careful there to associate indirect costs to transaction costs, and any direct cost of going out into the market as the actual cost of the outsourcer. Okay, so that's question number one. I'll just move you down to this next question, which covers the area of Porter's five forces, which I'm hoping you're familiar with. You'll remember from your studies that essentially this Porter's five forces model is simply a way of us sort of looking at a market or looking at an industry and assessing really how attractive it is. So 16.2 asks us, particularly in relation to one key element of that model, and that is the threat of substitutes. And I've highlighted the answer here for us. Keywords really are needs, or indeed same needs. And the key point here, I think, from my sort of delivering E2 for a number of years, is that students get this wrong. They think that a substitute is very simply another product provided by a competitor. In other words, that it's the same product. Well, it's not. It's one that simply meets the same needs, but it may be made or delivered in a different way. Okay, so a typical example might be sort of email versus letter. Maybe that's not the best example I could have come up with. Try and think of maybe other examples of in this particular area. So substitute, same needs, made or delivered in a different way. Okay, 16.3, a little bit of a curveball question here, and it's always important with these MCQ questions, as I've said in class, is to just read the question carefully. Keywords for me here are formal and outside. So we're talking really about sources of information. We're talking about sort of data collection, or indeed information collection, or a slight difference between the two. Obviously information being processed, data that's usable, that we can make decisions with. So those are the key words in this question, and we'll just come to C, what should be D and E. here, and just to draw your attention to the fact that with C they're talking about a sales ledger. Now clearly that is internal rather than external or indeed outside. So we should have been able to see that wouldn't be applicable for this answer. Similarly, although a little bit more sort of loose, this idea of work patterns or the observation of work patterns by an IT specialist, and certainly in class this is one that students have some trickiness with, in the sense that an IT specialist is perhaps external or outside, but I think the issue is that work patterns are certainly internal. Yeah, so really for C and what should be D here, it's just this idea that this information is, albeit for the fact that it may be useful, it's coming from an internal source, not an external source. Okay. This last one here, probably a little bit easier because of the fact that this information or this information, this news report, is coming sort of informally. In other words, from the chief executive's husband. It must really be informal, so it goes against our formal collection issue up here. Okay, so the answers are really A and B. Market research, maybe that would have been easy to pick out because we should be familiar with the fact that market research is normally taken out from information from outside sources, certainly, and it's a pretty formal method of collection. Okay, this next one here, perhaps again a little bit looser. We're talking about employees and health and safety legislation. I think the thing to bear in mind is that it's a fairly formal process, and this legislation is external, or it is from an outside source. Obviously, it's legislation prescribed by government. Therefore, it is an outside source. The answer in this case is A and B. Okay. This next one here of authority and indeed types of authority. Okay, so what do we have at 16.4? We've got a HR manager advising or providing advice to another departmental manager. But what they say is that the final decision, the final decision for Jesse May, rests with him, or indeed her. So in other words, the final decision rests within the department that's receiving the advice. So in essence there's no sort of line authority. In other words, the HR manager doesn't have authority over the receiving department. And really, hopefully, that drew us to this part B here, or answer B, staff authority. And what is that? And that's essentially where you have one department providing what we call specialist advice, but there's no final sort of line authority. In other words, the decision rests with the receiving department. So that's what staff authority means. Compare that with line authority, and that's really something that we are familiar with, I guess, within our own jobs. It's sort of, coming down the sort of chain of command. It's vertical. It's where an individual has authority over subordinates. So we're thinking of a manager versus sort of employees within that manager's department. So that very much flows through the hierarchy. This third one here, functional authority, just note that that's really a combination of the above. It's where we do have perhaps some advice coming from another department, but we have control. In other words, we do have, let's say, the HR manager actually having control over what the other department does, and the final decision would rest with that HR manager as opposed to the receiving department. I think departmental authority is a distractor. So let's just try and remember line, staff, and functional. Functional being a combination of line and staff certainly where no line authority exists. Okay. 16.5, seeing this area, this cultural models examined quite a lot, and what they do here is they combine it with a little bit of a sort of project management or matrix structure. Now, hopefully we'll be familiar with the fact that matrix structure for project management is certainly the preferred structure for CIMA E2 for your examiner. And what does it mean? Well, essentially that it means that you may have a series of projects, and really the projects are sort of in effect using functional expertise across a range of functions, perhaps IT, sales, accounting, etc. So really you have individuals involved in the project team sort of reporting to really two managers, not least the project manager themselves, but also their own manager. Maybe some problems associated with that arrangement, and when you come across this matrix structure, do try and think about sort of upsides and downsides. Downsides really are just this idea of confusion for the individuals concerned, is who's more important, their project manager or their own manager. In terms of upsides, what does the matrix structure give us, and why is it sort of the preferred structure for projects? Well, it does give us a lot of flexibility. This idea that we're drawing in expertise and knowledge from a variety of different people across a range of different functions, and that's what makes it attractive. So, in terms of tying that into sort of the cultural models, these would be the four that we'll see. Certainly task is the one that stands out, because task culture is all about the job. In other words, it's all about results and getting things done, and therefore flexibility is key. So let's associate the matrix structure with the idea of flexibility, that the task is all important. We've got to get the task done, and everyone's working towards that goal. So that's why answer B is relevant in this case. Just a quick word on the others there. Person culture, serving the person or serving the individuals. A typical example of that, one I use in class, would be perhaps a barrister's chamber, where perhaps everything is focused around the individual barrister, or indeed the barristers, and they're all important. Everyone else sort of exists in a sort of an admin sense, as it were. Okay. Role culture, again, we'll be familiar with this. Very much bureaucratic, slow. Rules and procedures. Everything's based around people's roles. Okay. And a power culture, as you would expect, focused in on probably one individual. The owner or the founder. Maybe well suited to smaller organizations where an individual is wielding sort of power over a number of other people. And perhaps a good example of that might be sort of Ryanair with Michael O'Leary, where his personality and his power sort of pervades, really every aspect of the organization. So, watch out for these questions. Seems to be a popular one. Okay. Next one. This one here, I think is a very, very tricky question. I think where you're required to pick out, 2 or 3 from a long, long list, or where they don't tell you perhaps how many you need to pick out. I think it makes it tricky. That's the first part of this. The second part of this question makes it tricky is really the subject matter. We're talking here about, or they're asking for, the main elements involved in negotiation. And I think when you scan down them, depending on how much rote learning or study that you've done in this area, it may be tricky to distinguish between quite a few of them. So let's try and sort of give you a fix on probably the wrong answers first. A and B, in fact, are the correct answers, but let's look at C and D for the moment. Really what we're saying here with conflict resolution, problem solving, as far as your examiner is concerned, we can use negotiation to resolve these. In other words, to resolve conflicts or to resolve problems. We can use negotiation. As far as E and F are concerned, these are approaches to negotiation. In other words, we use these approaches, and as you'll see, distributed bargaining, essentially we're talking there about just this idea of really shelling out resources to respective parties, shelling out finite resources. So in essence, really, we're talking about a situation where some, let's say, departments or functions will win, and some may lose. In other words, not everybody's going to get what they need. Okay, and that's really distributed bargaining. In terms of integrative bargaining, really, what we're meaning there is that we have some form of win-win situation. In other words, the parties are, negotiating and sort of, to some extent, sort of putting their differences aside, and really everybody wins. Now, in reality and practice, as we know, that may be a very, very difficult sort of thing to achieve, particularly where each party has quite strong views in relation to their argument. So I think in terms of a summary here on E and F, really what they're saying is that you can approach negotiation in this way. In other words, either distributed bargaining or integrative bargaining, and the favored approach is very much F, integrative bargaining. Okay, so back up to A and B. So why or how could we distinguish those from the rest of the answers, particularly in F? Well, I think it's tricky. I think it's tricky to do. What do they mean? Well, purposeful persuasion simply means arguing. Yeah, it simply means trying to persuade the other party that your stance is a better stance. Okay, constructive compromise. Well, basically, it just means compromising. In other words, giving up something. So I think, in terms of a summary on this question, as I've said, I think it's a little bit tricky. I think we need to rote learn it. We literally need to rote learn it. Don't question it, just rote learn it. So, elements involved, purposeful persuasion, constructive compromises, um, approaches, distributed bargaining, integrative bargaining, and we can use negotiation in these areas. Okay. Right, moving on to the next one here. This is a question that caused one or two difficulties when we went through it in class. It just really relates to this idea of mentoring and who would be best to provide a solution to a given manager's problem. And what we'll see, if you bear with me 1 second, what we'll see here is that we have an individual who is having an issue with certain aspects of a new job. And this particular case, this individual who's an accountant is looking to discuss standard areas, budgets, revised forecasts, etc., with a number of different sort of parties across the organization. And because the position is new to this individual, they're unsure as to who they should ask. Now, in a practical sense, in sort of, I guess in real life, there's several of these answers that you might think were relevant. I think what we need to do, as we've said in classes, is we need to think like the examiner thinks. So in this sort of situation, we've got someone who's a little bit unsure of who they should go to in relation to a particular issue that they have. They're dealing with various departments, various different staff, they're new to the job. Really, what the examiner wants you to do is to opt for the mentor, in other words, T's mentor, who will be best placed to give the individual a sort of an overview of the organization. You might think that the line manager in real life, or possibly even the sort of finance director, might be the easiest port of call, but let's just think like the examiner does. Certainly the mentor, as far as they're concerned, would be the first port of call. Obviously, junior assistant I don't think would be relevant. Okay, so C is the answer in that case. So 16.8, we're talking about change here. Do remember that the area of change is a new inclusion as from January 2015 in your syllabus. So the chances of it being examined in MCQ questions and indeed on the case study are very, very high. So do have a close look at that chapter. This area here of types of change, what I've done is just given you a quick spin through, what these words mean. Adaptation, no new paradigm. What do we mean by paradigm? Well, really sort of state, I guess, or situation. So we're saying that no new state occurs. It's a sort of an incremental step-by-step process. Reconstruction, again, no new state or no new paradigm, but it's rapid. Yeah, it's very, very quick. Okay. Evolution, we do have a new paradigm, incremental, probably part of a sort of a learning process. And revolution may be sort of as easy as adaptation to pick out because it's so severe, it's a new paradigm, it's rapid, and it may be very, very obvious. So when we scan down the rest of the answer, I think I've sort of noted on the left-hand side, maybe in terms of a process of elimination, what would you do first? I'd be inclined to look for adaptation and indeed revolution first, because I think they're easier to pick out. I've said number one here. This is the first place I would go because the most common type of change is something that doesn't result in a new paradigm. It sort of happens sort of over time, and that is very much adaptation. Yeah. So no new paradigm, a step-by-step approach, probably the most common type. The answer there is A for adaptation. And then I've said I think I would go for maybe the other side of the coin, as it were, or the far side of the coin is number two. I'd go for something that is very rapid, results in a new paradigm, and very obvious. And we're just trying to pick out the words that are relevant from up here. So this second one here, sorry, this first one, or the second one that I would do, very, very obvious. I think that has to be D. So it has to be revolution. So really this is I guess the opposite of adaptation. In terms of the other ones, let's take this first one here. We see a change undertaken within an existing paradigm, rapid and extensive. Okay, and I've slotted for B here, reconstruction. Certainly no new paradigm, but it is very, very quick, or needs to be very, very quick. Okay, so that gives us B. And obviously the last one, by process elimination, we've got a change that's part of a sort of an incremental process, does lead to a new paradigm, as you see above. Evolution versus revolution. Evolution sort of change over time, certainly going to lead to a new paradigm. Certainly incremental, and a learning process will take place. So DBAC for that. Okay, watch for those questions, seem to be quite popular. Okay, next one here, 16.9. Really, we're talking again about project management, and one of the key things that we need to do at the outset of any project is really to establish when we're initiating whether or not the project is feasible or indeed achievable. So how do we do that? Well, we undertake, as you see, a feasibility analysis. So do remember that this occurs at the initiation stage. It may well be that the idea of achieving objectives in a cost-effective manner, in other words, that's what the analysis does or tells us. Maybe it isn't possible. Maybe there are factors within this particular project that we think aren't achievable given the resources that we have, and that we can't sort of provide deliverables within our sort of iron triangle of time, cost, and quality. We just can't do it, so therefore we don't go ahead. So this feasibility analysis is important for every project. What are the key areas? Well, hopefully you remember from your studies that it's a sort of a four-pronged area, technical, social, ecological, and financial. Financial is easy enough. We're talking about cost benefit. Can we do it in a cost sense? We're going to look at techniques such as NPV, payback, etc. Technical, watch for that. When we say technical, what we're saying is that can we achieve the project in a technical sense? That could be anything. It doesn't have to be IT related. It could be perhaps are we able to do it from a sort of a manpower viewpoint? It could be a marketing issue, possibly even a sales. So technical is really just covers a wide range of things. So for social, we're looking really at people there. What's the sort of impact on people? Do we have the people available? Think people for social. Ecological should be fairly obvious. I think we're talking about sort of impact there on the environment and indeed ecology. Okay. Last one here for us, 16.10. This one relates to, bear with me one second, just this idea, again, we're back to sort of the environment here. And what they do here is they bring in Mendelow's matrix. So Mendelow's matrix, as you hopefully are aware, really is just a simple grid. So we're looking at stakeholders, we're trying to assess them, we're trying to sort of rank them or prioritize them, as it were. And what Mendelow does is provide us with a sort of a four-part grid where he gives us some advice. Now, in relation to this particular question, we've got a supermarket chain. They may well have a sort of an impact on the environment with what they're planning to do with this shopping development. And really what we're asked to do is provide Mendelow's advice in relation to the particular strategy that would suit this particular stakeholder. So there are local nature appreciation groups. So really we've got to rank them in some way based on power and interest. Now an appreciation group, they're certainly going to have a very, very high interest, clearly, but do they really have a lot of power? Probably not unless they tie in with another stakeholder, they're unlikely to have a great deal of power. They may be able to make some noise, but power, I'm not so sure. So I think they'd really be low power and high interest, okay? And on that basis, they would be sort of kept informed. They're not overly important, but what we don't want them is to either move into a different group by gaining some more power, or maybe joining up with another group, okay? So the answer there is B for 1610. Okay, hopefully that's been helpful. More short screencasts to follow, and good luck with your studies.